Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the series on Dungeon Crusade. This particular entry is actually going to be two parts, and we're going to take a deep dive into the components. Look at the quality of things, look at some of the art, look at some of the details. For those of you who like to keep your games 100% spoiler-free, no surprise, or all surprises kept as a surprise, you may want to skip these two videos that are going to be going up back to back, because we are going to be taking a look at detail at just about everything. Starting with the rulebook here, which, all right, let's look at the size of the rulebook. Yes, it is a good size. It's that magazine size. It is the Crusaders Handbook, as Roger is calling it, and it is quite lengthy at, what is it, over 80 pages? No, about 70 pages. So it's a long one, and it is verbose. There is a lot of words in here. I'm sure if somebody would edit it down to a concise rulebook, you could probably get all the rules in about 24 pages. So when you get the game, don't think that this represents the complexity of the game. This just represents the way that Roger likes to explain things in a lot of detail. I am looking forward to somebody creating a player aid, a shorter version of the rules to reference while you are playing, because I have found that while the rules are in this book, while it is perfectly capable and easy to learn the game from these rules, going back and looking things up while you are playing can be a little difficult. It's easy to find the section that you're looking for because of this really nice table of contents. And also, it does have an index. Once you get to this section, I do find that it is a little hard to find the detail that you're looking for, just because of how wordy it is. But it is a nicely laid out rulebook with a ton of art and examples, which is something that I appreciate. You do get a list of all the components that come in each version of the game, including the add-ons. You do get a nice overview of everything. This is a rulebook that kind of starts wide and then gets narrow as it goes. It's in that kind of style. It is going to take some time to get through your first time, though, so don't think you're going to set up the game and be playing within like an hour, unless you already somehow know how to play the game. There is a lot to read and a lot to digest. This is a game that is wider than it is deep. I'm not saying it's a shallow game. Well, I guess it is shallow. It's not a mechanically complex game. It is a wide game just in terms of how many options you have and all the different things you can do. But each individual part is relatively easy to learn and not complex. We're not talking Mage Knight here. It's more probably in line with, if you were to probably maybe like Advanced Hero Quest level, maybe somewhere in between like Warhammer Quest and Advanced Hero Quest. It definitely has an old school vibe to it. This is a game that feels like kind of like Dungeon Universalis. It's crazy that we got Dungeon Universalis and Dungeon Crusade back to back within about a year of each other. I don't know if you guys realize it or not, but we are just in like this golden age of fantasy gaming right now, especially in terms of art. I think it's so important to think about how much art we get in our games now. Back in the day, even though some of us appreciate the older art style, of old school games, I would be completely lying if I said that I wasn't impressed by how much art is in games these days and how much of it is so good, even though it may not have that character of that old school feel that some of us like. It's just, the artists really do help make our games more fun, and it's just something that I think we need to pay more attention to and give more praise to. And this game has so much art, and so much of it is so good, and I'm glad that Roger again did give credit to all of the artists that worked on the game. So really neat. It's a really great time to be into fantasy gaming right now, let me tell you. It's like almost too good. It's like an abundance of riches. After the rule book, we have our scenario book. I believe there are 10 different scenarios, And the scenarios are split between 4 different dungeons. So your base dungeon that comes with the game, you have your ancient ruins on one side. On the other side, you have your Tomb of Kaladar. And then you also have, with the expansion boards, you have your Castle Blackwood and your Cavern of Lost Souls. Right now, I have this is kind of like the main board that is set up. This is the Ancient Ruins. This is the board that you probably want to start with that first scenario, the kind of a learning scenario with some easier quests to get yourself used to the game. But the scenario system, one thing, there are basic setup instructions in the rulebook. The basic setup instructions are used the same in every game, but then you want to go to the scenario book to look at some of the more advanced setup rules. I was reading the initial setup and there were things that I was like, well, how do I do this? How do I do that? They're actually in this book because the advanced setup will be somewhat different depending on which quest and which scenario you take. These scenarios, even though there are only 10, don't think of them as that being like the 10 different stories you're going to play. It's not really like that. The scenarios are like they contain quests, and each scenario you're going to have 9 quests to solve. You're going to have 3 sets of 3. You're going to have a main quest, and you're going to have a side quest, and then you have to defeat a boss. You have to do that 3 times. You have to dive. You have to go on 3 excursions into the same dungeon, beat a main quest, a side quest, and a boss on each excursion. And then that is how you actually win a game of Dungeon Crusade. And the scenarios have a little story, and then they will contain your individual quest stories. But the scenarios, what they really are, it's kind of like a difficulty setting mechanism where it tells you your different quests that you're going to go on. It tells you your different random elements that you're going to be seeding the dungeon with, things that you don't really know what you're going to discover until you open a door or something like that. You're going to have randomize how much starting gold your characters have to shop with before their first excursion. You can randomly determine how many potions the bazaar has for you to purchase. You can randomly determine how many of each level of loot the blacksmith is going to have available. You can randomly determine the village terror starting level, the raid difficulty, the guardian spawn track, the guardians per quest, or how many minions are on the board. You don't have to randomly determine that. You could just follow a column. You could pick the easy mode and just do everything on easy. You could pick the master mode and do everything on master. So you have a lot of different options to shape the difficulty of your game. And that is one way that if you wanted to play with fewer than 6 heroes, you could shape a game to where the game accommodates like only 4 heroes. So very cool system. I have not really seen a scenario system like this really in any game. There is a lot of options for replayability, and I know that is super important to a lot of players. This could be a game that somebody could buy, and probably if they get really into the hobby, this becomes a hobby game for them, and you could spend probably a year just playing Dungeon Crusade and be completely content with that, especially if you are into the hobby side, developing your own quests, crafting things for your dungeon and that kind of stuff. I'm really curious, really excited to see what certain people are going to be doing with their games of Dungeon Crusade. So you have Into the Depths, Darkness Descending, An Onslaught of Evil, Welcome to Castle Blackwood, Siege on Salem Port, A Prophecy Foretold, The Fall of Briarwood, Origins of Evil, The Looming Shadow of Kaladar, and The Scourge of the Underworld. One thing I did want to talk about real quick, speaking of art, is if you look at this map of Avalon that is on the scenario book, it has this really cool layer of detail. And the contrast is really high. Darks are dark, the lights are light. I love the look at this. Now, the same map is used for the Avalon Adventure board game, but it doesn't have that layer of detail, and it looks a little more, I don't want to say washed out, but it almost looks like a layer of fog is over the land. I mean, if you just look at and compare those two, you can see a pretty stark difference in contrast. I really wish we could get this board with this version of the painting. I really like it. I think it looks fantastic. So maybe that'll be a possibility, an alternate board for the Avalon Adventure board game. I don't know if that will be a possibility, but it's something to think about. A couple other boards you're going to get, of course, are the Village board and the Dungeon UI board. Now, the Village board is what I am not using while I play. We'll take a quick look at that. One thing is these boards are just kind of like very thick cardboard. They're pretty good quality, but they do come with squared off corners, and even when I pulled it out of the box, I noticed that the corners were already starting to fray. So I did take my handy dandy corner punch and I went ahead and rounded off the corners on these boards, and it looks much nicer. So your village board, you're going to be visiting the village in between excursions into the dungeon and at the beginning of the game, and there are a number of things you can do while you're at the village. You can visit the temple to get blessed by an angel, to where you might get a certain power going into the dungeon. You can go to the bazaar, where you can buy health potions and various potions and torches. You can go into the academy, where you can level up your special abilities. You can go to the tavern, to where you can regain your essence. The blacksmith, where you can buy your different common, uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary gear and other things. You can, when you die, you're going to get resurrected. When you come back into the village, you can go to the House of Chance to gamble to get money. The only thing that this has in terms of gameplay is this terror level, which is going to start on a certain number depending on the difficulty. If it ever reaches that last spot, you are defeated, and that is how you lose a game of Dungeon Crusade. And there are a few different ways that terror level is going to raise during the game. If a minion escapes the dungeon, if a vagrant minion becomes a raiding minion, they're going to run out of the dungeon to terrorize the village. If a hero perishes, if the encounter deck runs out, or if a hex is placed on a village. So that really is the main way you're going to lose a game, and I would just keep track of that with a D12 since I'm not using this board. The board I will be using is this Dungeon UI board, which has all kinds of information on it. Now I'm thinking about actually making this into just kind of like a small 8.5 by 11 sheet with check boxes or things that I can circle and print them out for each game, just to save a little more space for those of us in small rooms with small tables. That is something we have to think about. And you do kind of have to weigh, is a little extra work worth it to play a certain game? You know, some games I don't want to spend the time to figure out how to play them on a small table. Hunter's AD is a game that I sold because it would not fit. I could not figure out a way to make it fit, even if I was going to do work at it. Dungeon Crusade, I have to do a little bit of work to make it fit in my setup, but there are some extra things you can do to make it even smaller. So this is one area where you might be able to, you'll lose like the cool look, but you can get the functionality, because here you're going to keep track of your mining decks, to where you can go to these certain mining nodes on the map. Every map has a certain number of little spaces where you can mine for gems that you can take back to the blacksmith. You have your quest tables here, where you're going to keep track of your quests each time you go into the dungeon. You have your guardian spawn track. That's going to tell you how you roll a d20. If you hit the number or over, a guardian spawns into your dungeon. You're going to have a place for your celebration day decks, your treasure chest deck, and your encounter deck. You have your combat phase chart here. Your incantation, when you evade from a chamber combat, depending on the level of the monster you are evading from, they will enact an incantation. If this incantation track ever fills up, the village gets hexed, and that's one way that you can move towards losing. When you complete a series of 3 quests, after that, you then have like 3 turns until you are automatically teleported back to the village. Here you have your raid difficulty. You have to roll either a d20, 12, 10, 8, 6, or 4, depending on the difficulty level. And then if you roll the highest number on each die, then that minion becomes a raiding minion, and they want to attack the village. And then you can keep track of how many minions are going to be in your dungeon while you are playing. So a neat board. It does take up some space. It does look nice. It's a little more form than function, but there is some function to it. And so that's why one reason I've decided to use that. So now let's take a look at the dungeon boards themselves. So I do wish that it was a single map, like a gatefold or a six-fold or three-fold, trifold, like the big Arkham Horror 2nd Edition maps or boards. They are individual boards, and they are pretty good quality. I have noticed that, so like these were the extra boards that came with the expansion, and my corners did get smashed up a little bit, and I've heard of that happening to other people. Another thing that happens when boards are like this, and this happened with my Machina Arcana, some of those tiles, it happens with tiles in Shadows of Brimstone, in Silver Tower. It's not a particular problem to this game, it is just a particular problem to this kind of map tile, that in some areas the image that is printed on hangs off a tiny bit around the edges. And it does start to peel off, especially if you pick it up and you don't grab it from underneath and your finger kind of like hits that lip of that edge. It does start to peel off, and as you can see, it is already starting to fray on the corners there. And that is something that if you don't take care of right away, it will get worse and it will be pretty hard to take care of. This one is particularly bad. I just noticed that. So what you want to do is you want to get some super glue with a brush on applicator and just brush on a light bead of super glue along the edges there. I do wish that these tiles were a little better made. I wish they had some kind of protective tape border around the entire edge just to keep that from happening, because unless you protect those edges, these boards are going to wear out. Not quickly, but they're not going to be around for years like you would want them to. So that is something to think about. Something not to think about is how good the art is on these boards. I have no problem saying that these are the coolest looking dungeon tile boards I have ever seen. The art is so good. The colors are so good. There are so many little details, so many things that just pop off the page, so many things that entice my imagination. I especially cannot wait to explore the Tomb of Kaladar. I mean, just look at the detail in this thing. There is so much going on. This map is just, it is a masterpiece of dungeon art. It is so cool. One thing I do use is I do use this non-skid pad underneath my tiles so they do stay in place. That's another reason why I wish it was a single board, just because it's just easier to for things to stay in place. I was a little afraid that it would be difficult knowing how to position things, but it's really not at all. It's very, very intuitive. This map here is really cool because it has an outdoor and an indoor. See, yeah, it is a little, there is quite a bit of warping to these expansion tiles, unfortunately. And these have been under heavy books for like a couple days now. So that does, I am a little concerned about that, because there is no way that these will lay flat on the table. This side will lay flat because it's going like this. But when you set that up for this side, when you set up 6 individual boards, your ends are just not going to meet. So that is a little concerning. I wish that was not the case. Hopefully other people don't have the same amount of warping that I do on my tiles. I might have to see about getting some of these replaced if they continue to warp more. A lot of my tiles for Myth are really, really warped. And depending on, how they were cured, Sometimes you can get them to warp back or to warp in the opposite direction by placing weight on them, but sometimes you just can't if they're already like completely dry. So that is a little bit of a bummer, and it's something that will bug me a little bit. But the art is, there's so much to like about it that I'm not going to let it bother me too much, and I'm really looking forward to diving into this game. So that is the first part. The next part, we are going to start taking a look at the cards and all of that. So all right guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this detailed look at some of the components, and coming up soon will be a detailed look at the rest of the components. So take it easy guys, we'll talk to you later. Bye bye.